This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, the editor-in-chief at FanDuel and at NumberFire.com, and this is episode 373 of the Late Round Podcast, one of many shows that are part of the FanDuel Podcast Network. Thanks for tuning in. One of the very first Late Round Podcast episodes was with ESPN's Mike Clay, and it was on the topic of building projections. Since that episode a few years ago, I've gotten loads and loads of questions on this topic. They've ranged from, how do you project efficiency, to how do I start building projections of my own? So I thought it would be good to do another show on the process of building projections, and this time, I wanted to bring on my buddy Rich Hribar from SharpFootballAnalysis.com to talk about it. Rich is my sounding board for fantasy football thoughts. If I have a weird idea about something that I want to investigate, or if I found something interesting when looking at data, I go to Rich. I run it by him and see what his thoughts are on the topic. Because he's one of the smartest fantasy football analysts in the business. He just gets it. And that goes for building projections as well. I sat down with Rich to talk about his projection building process, how he thinks people misuse and misunderstand fantasy football projections, and we talk about how he specifically projects things like volume, efficiency, and touchdowns. We try to cover it all on this show so that you, if you're interested, you can start building projections on your own and taking your fantasy football game to the next level. Now, before getting into the interview, I wanted to let you guys know that FanDuel Sportsbook is giving you a chance to get in on the action risk-free. Create a FanDuel Sportsbook account today and place your first bet. If you lose, you'll receive a refund of up to $500 in site credit. It's that easy. For more details, visit sportsbook.fanduel.com. Offer valid for new users only. Must be 21 years old. Gambling problem? Call 1-800-GAMBLER. Now sit back and get your mind ready to listen to Reeves dig deep into his projection building process. All right, Rich, let's start with sort of more of a philosophical question about projections. Do you think that projections in the fantasy football world are misused and maybe overused? Or maybe, to put this another way, what are some of the flaws of drafting your fantasy football team via projections?
First of all, let me say that I'm flattered that you had me on this show about projections. You know, I'm probably not someone in the industry thinks it was like a pantheon on this topic. But when you think of projections, you think of guys like Mike Clay. But projections themselves have taken such a root in fantasy now. You know, every site has a lineup optimizer, you know, which is projection based. You know, the big sites like Roto Grinders, you know, Osmo, Fantasy Cruncher are all like people that are just on the champions of this topic. I'm also pretty sure that you're big enough now you probably could get Nate Silver to come on this show and break down projections with how you've gone. But you and I frequently behind closed doors, and if there ever was a humble brag, you know, talk about fantasy and share a lot of projection stuff. So, you know, everyone gets me here. So let me get back on track here before we need Denzel and Chris Pine to get us back on the right track. For sure, though, we could this could carry the whole show, this topic. I mean, yeah. But definitely the way, you know, rankings and projections are presented and consumed in the fantasy industry are a long-running kind of, you know, pet peeve. I'm guilty of also playing a role in there despite my best efforts to bridge that gap. So if you want to call me a hypocrite, I mean, I could take that. But, you know, sometimes you got to play the game the way it is played. But today's fantasy landscape is more statistically saturated than ever, something I'm definitely grateful for, and I'm sure you are as well. But that has pushed more work towards, you know, models and a linear consumption and presentation of fantasy football in general. And we're losing a lot of big picture focus now on game theory, understanding and applying ranges of outcomes, and some other ticks that are part of, you know, being a consistently good, you know, fantasy player in dynasty, season long, or DFS, no matter what you're playing. And, you know, projections and rankings, if you look at them, they typically just resemble what just happened, which we know is already, you know, kind of a fallacy. But the strongest correlation coefficiency metrics in fantasy football still carry and maintain, you know, a mountain of variance. We're trying to be in a strike zone of projections to help us get there, but they and the projections and subsequent ranks that come from the projections are often presented and consumed as absolutes. You know, but really projections, like I said, are just trying to get in that strike zone, you know, probability instead of, you know, trying to split three arrows down in bullseyes, you know. So even when we nail projections and we're dead on accurate from a seasonal stance, which I believe is easier than to be accurate on a weekly stance, those numbers actually mean per player, you know, what those numbers actually mean for a fantasy player is also inherently variant because, you know, what they how they contribute to seasonal outcomes, since the majority of players basically thrive on having pockets of spikes of production and lulls, over an abundance of guys that are just weekly wire to wire true fantasy assets carrying your team. So that's why I've always kind of done my tiers, how players score versus a linear list, because arbitrage is driven strongest by the manner in which production is accrued, and then the order of those players, the rankings, is driven by opportunity, on that comes from a player and team level, which can fluctuate. So I always want to know how players being used firsthand, and then the opportunity level gets weighed in those rankings. But if you're drafting solely on projections as an absolute, we can lump rankings in, even though this isn't a ranking show. You're missing a lot of the full picture and limiting yourself to one outcome that needs to be accurate, which we've kind of shown we're not great at.
Yeah, well, speaking of the act of building projections, people who don't think projections are helpful, they might say that it's because there's subjectivity involved in building them. So do you think that there's any substance to that sort of claim? And what do you think is helpful about the act of building projections and having them?
It comes down to who you take, your information from and their process in building their projections. There are threads of subjectivity in just about everything fantasy oriented. And I do believe some retrofit their models in a sense for past hit rates over true predictability. And some people will build, their model or projections to, tell themselves the story that they want to hear. When, like we said, that's what rankings are for. It's the rank. That's what the rankings are for, the difference between rankings. But I would say for me personally and how I build and use projections, that in fact the opposite is true. More often than not, my projections are causing me to go back and reevaluate players I'm subjectively higher or lower on. Than what my projections are suggesting. They're kind of a speed governor on subjective influence, the way I use them. And that's how they should be used, from a seasonal stance, as sobering checks and balances, process of understanding how top-down team output is distributed and opportunity among the players on those teams. This is especially applicable in this current moment when we're fresh off the NFL draft, and every NFL draft pick is viewed through the tunnel vision of having only ceiling outcome, not only for their careers, but immediately in 2020.
Yeah.
They also should be used to highlight things like you or the market is overlooking. A guy we talked about frequently, last year was Allen Robinson in that late last year. That was something that definitely paid off for both of us. But there is no doubt that, the projections process itself has policed my subjectivity more than vice versa.
All right, so let's talk a little bit about the projection building process, the actual act of building, because we know, as we just talked about, that building projections can at least be helpful in showing us different paths and where a ceiling and floor is for a particular player. And people listening to this right now are probably most interested in how they themselves can make projections, but they have no idea where to start. So where do you think they should start? How do you think that they should be thinking about building projections? Should they just be looking at players individually, or should they be looking at things sort of more holistically, from a top-down, team-level first approach?
There's a lot that goes into building projections, especially for my end. I'm sure people, like I said, that I mentioned earlier, show a more simplistic way. But I use, historical league trends and then scale down for team production and trends, which are coaching staff and player influence, then scale down to, into the actual, players getting the opportunities. So from a league perspective stance, league average, yards per play, pass rate, scoring rates, yards per attempt are all significantly higher than they were just 10 years ago, an era where a lot of these coaches and coordinators were actually still a part of, and people still apply to the current era. But that's where I start, to get a surface area. Then I go team by play volume first. And I use a lot of expected win totals to generate, potential game script for these teams. And then once there, it's all about, divvying up the opportunities and then the players giving those opportunities. But game script literally drives everything on a play calling stance in the NFL. You just look at the San Francisco 49ers, who just went to the Super Bowl. Kyle Shanahan and his system, we know what a system is, but their run rates since Kyle Shanahan's been there have been 39%, 42%, and then 49% last year. They get up to 50% because of game script. That's how you get those big spikes. We know inherently what Kyle Shanahan wants to do, but what they can do afforded by where the team is positioned on the scoreboard is a different story. So we've got a few of these teams I can give a couple examples of. We got a new head coach, new system, in a new place, which is always interesting to kind of involve in projections. Browns hiring Kevin Stefanski. And the expectation of limited value. People see the Vikings only ran 970 plays near the bottom of the league. He has only got 21 games as a sample as a play caller. The Vikings only threw 466 passes as a team last year. That a lot of people see that and they say, well, this is what the Browns are going to be. But Minnesota was a 10-6 team. They were 27th in the NFL, like I said, in offensive snaps. Mind you, Cleveland only ran 3 more plays than the Vikings last year. But the Vikings were 15th in overall in offensive pace. But they led for 47% of their plays, which is 7th in the NFL. But if you look under the hood, Minnesota actually played really fast in neutral negative game script. They were 25th in offensive seconds per play in the second half of games, but they were leading in the second. But when leading, they were 27th in pace. But if you look at it from an overall perspective, they were 8th in the NFL in first half offensive pace, period, whether they're winning or losing. And then at any point in the game trailing, they were 6th in offensive pace. Now, given the limitations of the Minnesota roster, Adam Thielen only played, 43% of the snaps, and what they had offensively outside of Stephon Diggs and Dalvin Cook, who also missed 2 games. I mean, you bring that pace and that fast pace that they had, and that's encouraging when you take into the account of if you're not expecting Cleveland to be one as good as Minnesota, and in terms of controlling games, and then they've got better, offensive players, I would say, objectively than what Minnesota had last year from a talent perspective. And then another one real quick is, the Packers are a really good team to look at in this regard, especially since we're fresh off the draft and the assumption based on their signal from the draft, and not even that, actually what they've told us publicly, their desire to run. But we should objectively be expecting the Packers to actually potentially have to throw more in 2020 than they did in 2019, which is kind of another ridiculous component to their approach of that draft. But, they were 13-3 despite their, expected record, which should have been 10-6. They went 9-1 in one-score games. Early lines have them at 8.5 over/under wins. They go from having at Sharp Football Analysis, our 13th easiest schedule in 2019 to the 8th hardest this year. They're another team. They led for 48% of their snaps, up 6th in the NFL. They led for 57% of their fourth quarter plays. But I can take that projected win total now and I can drop it, up and raise it to, teams that historically have gone from 8 wins to 10 wins, and say if they undershoot or overshoot, and look at the potential, game script that team might have. And it shows to me that they're probably going to have to throw more and be in more passing game scripts than they were a year ago, regardless of their initial, ramrod philosophy that they're entering this offseason with.
Yeah, something that really sheds light to this too is that if you look at previous season pass to rush attempt ratio, just overall ratio, so you mentioned the Vikings, for instance, I think they were 29th in the league in overall ratio, and then their neutral script ratio was like 23rd or something, so obviously there's a difference, meaning, when games are close, they're a little bit more pass heavy, but if you look at the predictiveness of overall ratio year over year versus neutral script ratio, there's a much stronger correlation with neutral script ratio from one year and then the next year overall ratio versus overall ratio from one year to the next. And what that's basically telling us is that game script will fluctuate a lot year over year because the NFL just has a lot of inherent variance. There's just a lot that changes year over year, which is why we see, teams like the 49ers come out of nowhere and they're very, very competitive. But that's really what's key is that you have to focus and you have to recognize game script. And one way of doing that, as you alluded to, Rich, is looking at projected win totals, which you can get, on places like FanDuel Sportsbook. There's my plug. There's my plug for the show. Yeah,
professional.
I'm a professional here. So let's look at player projections then, because they really come down to how you project volume and how you project efficiency. Those are the two big things when we're projecting players. So we already talked about that you're starting at the team level. Once you get those team level numbers down, plays per game, etc., now you're looking at the player level. Now with volume, we're looking at market share statistics like rushing share and target share. So how do you properly assign those numbers, those volume numbers to players? What's sort of your process for that?
This is interesting. So when I first started out, it used to be like we hit on the open, more coordinator based and looking at this historical, how players were used in specific systems. But one thing I've scaled back on significantly over the course of time is overfitting those previous coordinator coached usage and distributions per position on a blanket level. I found that, over the time of doing this, that personnel dictates more of what a team actually does in the distribution department over coaches setting out to get specific positions positions the ball more. That's generally driven by the talent level at those positions. There's still a framework of their coaching scheme and philosophy to apply what goes into things, such as the actual personnel usage distribution, like snaps played, that can be applied at the foundation level. Like we talked about Kevin Stefanski, like the wide receiver 3 for the Browns is probably not going to play a ton of snaps this year versus other teams, whereas the tight end 2 will. But the ball goes to the best players in the offense more often than not, regardless of the scheme and the coach's prior history, which I said is largely, just like that personnel driven in the first place. So I tend to stay in the framework of the scheme and then distribution to talent and work from there. Also, I'm looking at, per game opportunities on a player level. That is how often players that were injured the year prior or just disappointed on opportunities slip through the cracks, a la that Allen Robinson, a year ago. But the great part of getting to the usage stage of projections is when this is now where you can start to scope out your ranges of outcomes for players. Do you want to see what Clyde Edwards-Helaire looks like on 60% of the team carries and 14% of the team targets, the average of what Damian Williams had over his final 7 full games last season, to scope what a ceiling, outcome of usage could be? What about a floor? You can adjust for any type of split when you get to this level, and this is how you get your range of outcomes. But that's how you get your floor, your median, your ceiling for players to gauge. And this is how then you can apply risk and upside, to draft those players and into their cost in NFL, draft, the fantasy drafts, the ADP, especially ones, that have usage like I use Clyde Edwards-Helaire that will very likely have projectable variance on a weekly level compared to an overall season one. So that's where you can kind of play with that. But I definitely am looking at more on, a talent and player level, over the coaching level when I get to that point.
Yeah, and you can also use sort of league-wide trends and what we've seen historically from players to know, a wide receiver 3 is likely not going to hit a 20% target share in an offense. We just know that's likely not going to, in most offenses, right? Even if you don't know exactly how those offenses look, if you're not digging into the offensive scheme, etc., you at least know where certain thresholds are hit. Like, for instance, elite wide receivers are almost always going to see at least a 25% target share, right? And so you can look at DeAndre Hopkins moving over to Arizona. You know that they have a different type of offense where we're going to see 4+ wide receivers on the field often. Maybe that saturates things a little bit, but he's still DeAndre Hopkins. He's still going to see a really high target share. And the same was true for Odell Beckham last season, where if you have an elite talent and you know that it's an elite talent, you at least have some baseline that you can work with. And you shouldn't be projecting then players for, 35% target shares and 40% target shares, even though those things can happen. The Brandon Marshall back in the day getting that 40%, or Michael Thomas and what he's been able to do. It can happen, but we're also looking at the most likely outcome whenever we're projecting these things. And then, like you said, Rich, you can sort of go through and look at the range of outcomes for these different players if you want to bump them up and just see how that affects their projection in general. That's the beauty of building projections. So I'm going to use that same question, but instead of looking at volume, let's look at efficiency. We know that efficiency metrics aren't very sticky year over year. Volume metrics are stickier than efficiency metrics are. So how do you project things like yards per carry or yards per target?
So using stats for, individual players have a good amount of, the usage stats have a good amount of correlation, in context for running back snaps, touches, touches per game. Those are some of the stickiest year over year metrics for running backs. Targets per game, target share per game, and, average depth of target are sticky wide receiver stats. So we can use a lot of that. But then when you get to the yards per carry, yards per catch, yards per target, touchdown rates, all of those are like a mountain of variance. Definitely a lot of variance year to year. So for efficiency, I stay within the parameters of like the league base rates based on opportunity. When and where the touches are coming from, carries on the field. I said average depth of target is very sticky. That's very useful in figuring out catch rates and yards per reception. And then within that, I will then incorporate like the base rate of the individual player's career output. Some players are better with the targets. There just are better players and worse players in the NFL. So then I'll work from there. So a guy can have spikes in like how he's used. Like Stephon Diggs was a guy who had a huge average depth of target spike just kind of out of left field and how he was used last year compared to previous career. But for the most part, that stuff stays sticky, and we can kind of build off of there, understanding, where guys are getting the ball on the field and, depth of target for wide receivers. And then running back carries is just, like I said, I'm mostly hanging on to the league base rate and then, incorporating some player base rate stuff to get in that strike zone, in player context. That's really basically it. I mean, I'm really just operating on like a really league-wide level and like player level and operating in that strike zone instead of going, an absorbent way of saying I'm going to predict a guy to have 20 yards a catch when he's only averaged 14 yards per catch, over his career and stuff like that. So I'm really just operating within the parameters of like the base rate for the league and the player. It's really just as simple as that. I wish I had a lot more to get into.
No. I mean, that's the approach that I take as well. And I think that though this is a good time to talk about regression a little bit and how people will ask questions like if I say AJ Brown is my wide receiver 14 this year, I don't even know what he is, but let's just say that that's the example. And someone might come to me and they say, well, isn't AJ Brown supposed to regress? And I'm saying, yes, that's based on regression. We're looking at someone like AJ Brown's yards per target last year. We're seeing that players who have that high of a yards per target rate, even though we only have a 1-year sample on AJ Brown, the chances that he's able to maintain that efficiency year over year is very small. Basically, it's not going to happen. And so you can look at history and look at historical trends with not just rookie wide receivers. You're looking at all wide receivers and how they just generally regress. And then you can put that into your projection and realize that AJ Brown is not going to maintain that yards per target rate, but even still, this is what his projection is going to be. And then you can talk about AJ Brown a little bit more intelligently. And I think the other thing too, this goes to touchdown rate. And this is a nice segue as well, because touchdowns do drive fantasy football. But with touchdown rate, for instance, with quarterbacks, we know that quarterbacks are going to have a wide range from the worst starting quarterback in touchdown rate to the best. There's going to be a fairly wide range. Let's say it's going to be 7%, 6 to 7% each year. But we know that those numbers start to regress and kind of meet in the middle year over year, even though we're going to see that same spread in one particular season. But I'm curious, Rich, because touchdowns do drive fantasy football. Do you have a specific way that you project touchdowns?
Yes, I mean, I keep beating the same drum here, but, we're going back to the team level. We're looking at offensive production. Over the past decade, offensive yardage has an R squared of 0.7025 in relation to offensive touchdowns, meaning roughly 70% of all offensive touchdowns can be explained by yardage gained, which we can get through the measures that we just talked about, the question before, in terms of performance on opportunities. And then I want to look at, team touchdown distribution. I do an article on this every year too, which you could check. League rate of touchdowns scored has a 65 to 35 passing to rushing distribution. Some play callers run a little bit hotter. If you look at Bruce Arians, his offenses typically run about 70%, passing touchdowns to rushing touchdowns. But in the article that I just did last year, that was about last year's, I was projecting the Bills and Ravens to have more passing touchdowns last year based on what they did the year prior because they were an outlier. And, did I have Lamar Jackson projected for 36 passing touchdowns? No. Did I have Josh Allen projected, 40? But those guys were on my radar to have more passing upside than they were given credit for their first initial years than their rates were. Lamar Jackson had 3.5% touchdown rate. Josh Allen's, all his passing stats were a disaster his rookie season, and he took a significant step forward. That put me on to those guys. Last year, Carolina had a league low 46% of their touchdowns come via passing. I already told you, league average is 65%. And you look at, so historically, and some context there, of the 36 teams to be sub 50% since 2009, 32 of those 36 teams have seen a spike in passing touchdowns with an average of plus 7.3 passing scores the following season. Some other teams that ran cold there and unexpected play calling: Arizona, Green Bay, the Rams, all those teams should be expected to have more passing touchdowns this year than they had a year ago, at least in terms of split. So, I mean, getting back to that baseline split. And on the flip side, a team like Jacksonville, if you won Leonard Fournette last year, you already know this pain. 24 of their 27 offensive touchdowns came via passing. Pretty unheard of. Teams like Detroit, the Steelers, the Jets. There's some other teams that ran overly reliant on passing to rushing touchdowns. So then we're scaling the team and split down from a player and talent level opportunity again. Once we have, we're using the team yardage to get a touchdown total. We're using the base rate splits to kind of get a split for passing and rushing touchdowns. And then we're using the individuals that are going to occupy and absorb some of those touchdowns. I do something similar that Mike Clay does, to OTD and, similar to, depth of target, where players are getting their targets from. A guy like Tyler Boyd, he's had 6 end zone targets the past 2 years, 2 and 4. He's just not a guy that's going to have a large share of the team touchdowns. Could it flip and have variance one season? Yeah, absolutely. As opposed to like a guy like DK Metcalf, we only have a 1 year sample, he had 18 end zone targets. Kenny Galladay, another guy, like those guys are gonna, based on the opportunities they're getting, just have more chances to score touchdowns. So I'm using something similar to, Mike Clay and his OTD. And why would I not borrow from Mike Clay? He is the kind of the godfather of the projections. And when I see someone do smart things, of course I'm going to incorporate that into what I do. But that's kind of where we get to, again, team level, scale down to the player level, work your way down from there. Same story.
Yeah, and here's the other thing, too. For anyone who's listening to this and you're motivated to make some projections to just get a better idea of the fantasy landscape, to Rich's point, and I've obviously talked about yards to touchdowns plenty on this show to the point where people tilt their faces off whenever I bring it up, because it's not there to be this exact measure and exact way of doing things. But if we start at the team level and we look at how many touchdowns the team's supposed to score based on how many yards they're compiling, you can do it at the player level if you really want to, and then manually adjust based on what you think or what you foresee how teams are going to utilize certain personnel. I'm not saying that this is an exact way of doing it. I'm just saying it's a more approachable way for a lot of people who might be trying to build projections on their own. So a good example of this might be, let's just take the Chargers, for instance, with Austin Eckler and Josh Kelly. Austin Eckler sees 9 goal line touches last year, scores twice on those goal line touches. We know he's not necessarily a bigger bodied between the tackles running back as opposed to Josh Kelly, who they just drafted, who's sort of the Melvin Gordon replacement, or they're viewing him in that way, where he's a bigger bodied guy. He's a downhill runner, and he was used a lot in that area of the field at UCLA. We can at least think that Josh Kelly is going to see a decent chunk of that goal line work. So if you're doing a yards to touchdown conversion, for instance, you can then get that number, what that yardage total tells you, and then bump up Josh Kelly a little bit and that will naturally, if everything's tied together the way it should be, it'll just naturally bump down Austin Eckler a little bit. So even though we're talking about things like OTD and average depth of target, which we incorporate into our models and into our projections, that doesn't mean that someone listening to the show can't take that on sort of a more baseline level just to get a general idea of how these guys are going to score. All right, Rich, one last question for you. If you could give one piece of advice to anyone who's wanting to build projections, what would that one piece of advice be?
Don't overly retrofit coaching data that doesn't match personnel. Don't treat projections as rankings as tiers. Use them to highlight potential discrepancies in the draft market. Don't use projections to tell yourself the story you want to hear. Just do the objective job that you're set out to do that we talked about. Start at that team level, work your way down to that, and get to that strike zone of player level. But that's pretty much it. So like I said, I wasn't Nate Silver. Definitely. You probably wish you did ask Nate Silver at this point.
No, you were a perfect guest. Perfect guest, Rich. I really appreciate you hopping on. For any of you not following Rich and his work, you can check him out on Twitter at Lord Reeves and go read his work over on sharpfootballanalysis.com. I'm also on Twitter at Late Round QB, and if you're not subscribed to this podcast yet, make sure you're searching for the Late Round Podcast pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. Thanks for listening, everyone. I'll be back in your ears later this week.